Hello and welcome to the Research to Policy Talk series. It's convened by Epic India. Every week, it's my pleasure to talk to experts and get them to decode their research for us. We're looking for solutions for India's complex energy and environmental issues. Today's topic, climate change. Is India doing enough? Let me start by introducing my guest for today, Chetan Bhattacharjee. He's the managing editor of NDTV, a senior journalist and a passionate clean air advocate. He also sits on the governing board of an NGO called Care for Air. Amir Jina, he's the assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Amir is the co-author of a report that studied heat-induced mortality in India, which shows a rise in death rates due to climate change. A morbid statistic there, but one that reminds us of just how lethal climate change can be. So let me start by turning to Chetan. As someone in the media who's watching this as a bystander, India was in fact one of the few countries. Our Prime Minister went there and he actually raised our climate ambitions. Now, what is the narrative in the media as far as climate change is concerned in India? Because I found that in the Western media, India was in fact getting a lot of bad press because we said that we will go to net zero only by 2070. So while we're getting bad press abroad, what is the perception of the Indian media here?
I think thanks, Bahar, and thanks very much for having me on this platform. But I think it is getting a lot of coverage in the media, perhaps not as much as it should be, because given how climate change and what we saw unfolding in COP, it effectively showed the nations of the world are unprepared for the changes that are going to be that are required. Institutional changes, policy changes. These are very fundamental ways of actually changing the way we live, the way we govern ourselves, and all sorts of dynamics will change. And the world seems to be pretty unprepared. They have a rough idea that, okay, we have to hit, limit emissions by 2030, peak them by 2030 and whatnot. Yes. So I think it should be a lot more. It shouldn't be just linked to a leader saying this or a conference saying that. Those are event-based reportage, which I think we need to move beyond. Now, for instance, and how can we do that? We can do that in a couple of ways. I would imagine that there is enough information, enough data which is out there where we can make this a daily headline, climate change a daily headline. And I think that was something that we are still far away from. There are some specific individual niche publications and websites and which are doing that. But on the whole, I don't think it's happening as much in mainstream media, at least not in India. Yes. I do see this happening in several Western publications, but given the scale at which India operates, and the vast numbers of people and the vast, the numerous weather systems that we have here, I think we should be paying a lot more attention to this.
Okay. In fact, yours was one of the few news channels that prioritizes environmental news. I've noticed that over the years, whether it's air pollution, whether it's climate change, whether it's talking about biodiversity, yours is one of the few news channels that gives priority to it. But is that a challenge? Because climate change obviously doesn't sell as much as, say, Sachin Tendulkar or Salman Khan getting a new hairstyle. So how do you, in a newsroom, say, okay, this is something which deserves as much priority, if not more?
Yeah, it is a challenge. It is a challenge in the sense that apart from Sachin Tendulkar's hairstyle, there's so much more pressing stuff that is happening. And, in a country like India, where there are so many pressing and contrasting needs, there is bound to be a dozen other stories at any given point of time, which is going to be competing for headline space. As with my hat on as an editor hat on, I would say that, if there are a bunch of stories which have, politics or some kind of crisis or some kind of economic issues or joblessness or whatever it is, those are also going to be competing with the same kind of space. That even though I might be in favor of reporting more on climate change and air pollution,
Yes.
there is only limited space, so you have to have editorial priorities. So climate change, and I think this would be happening in several newsrooms, climate change linked stories have to really fight for their space in prime times and on the front pages. Really have to assert, the stories have to be really standout stories and really have some kind of a universal appeal, which is not always an easy thing to do.
Okay, Chetan. So we'll get into issues like, I think we need to discuss how do we tell climate change stories better. But let me get in our second speaker for today, Amir. I know that climate change stories tend to be all about doom and gloom. And your research seems to hit the nail on the head, because you've said that heat will kill more people than any other major disease by 2100. You've also said that the state of Odisha will be the worst hit. So take us through your research. And also, I'm curious to know, when you say any other major disease, does that also include the pandemic?
Well, the pandemic is an interesting thing to start with. I think when we were doing this research, we basically, what Chetan is saying, it's hard to communicate the impact of something when it's happening, when we're calculating what's going to happen with slow progress and this gradual change. Well, it's quicker, it's happening quicker than we would want it to, but thinking about, what the world is going to be like in 50 or 60 years, it's hard to really emphasize to people what the scope or the scale of those impacts are. So what we were trying to do when we do our research is say, let's compare it to something that people understand, something that people know today. And so the point that you raised there of comparing this to infectious diseases, we were comparing this to the current disease burden, or the disease burden in 2019 from infectious diseases in India. And we show that by the end of this century, climate change, particularly without much mitigation, would be of the same scale, kind of surpassing any individual disease and kind of looking about the same scale as all of the infectious disease deaths in India today as a contributor to mortality. Of course, the world changed dramatically in 2020. And I think what COVID did to highlight when thinking about climate change is that a lot of the impacts that we see in terms of health, they're not just coming from somebody experiencing the heat, having a heat stroke or heart attack or something, but there can also be these spillover effects, knock-on effects, if you will. You can have a situation where, let's say you have a massive heat wave in a huge city like Delhi or Mumbai or somewhere, and a lot of people need to get rushed to the hospital. What happens when that system starts to reach its limit? And that's kind of what happened. It happened in Italy first, and happened in New York, and very much to a huge degree happened in India in the spring.
Yes.
There was a lot of deaths happening because of a lot of people feeling bad at exactly the same time. We had oxygen shortages, we had a lot of things which could have been avoided. And so I think it highlights the extent to which, when climate change comes, not only is it going to affect health, but also it's going to affect a lot of people in the same way at the same time. And that's something we're just not really set up in any country, let alone in India. It's something that we're not set up to deal with very well.
Okay, so Amir, what you're saying to me is that the health infrastructure will be under pressure, as we've seen in the time of the pandemic. And just to understand your research, what you're saying is that the mortalities themselves from heat may not be that much, but the system will get overwhelmed. And you're dealing with systems that are already perhaps overstressed. You're looking at, our primary health centers may not be in the best shape. You're looking at areas where the nearest hospital will be 100 to 200 kilometers away. Then that creates a problem as well.
Yes, the mortality from heat actually is quite substantial as well. But I think now we're really aware of the fact that, as you're saying, the infrastructure is just not there. To jump back a little bit to the first part of your previous question, kind of talking through the research, we tend to focus here on trying to make sure that we have these impact estimates, these thinking about the consequences of climate change as informed by data as possible, real world data from actual countries that are exposed. And a lot of this learning that had happened in the past was really focused on data from rich countries, if it used data at all. And instead what we wanted to say is, let's turn this into something where we use, if we want to understand about India, we use actual Indian data. We understand what the reality is on the ground, and then we see what's going to happen in that country in the future. And not in a way which says, vague 1.5 degrees, but actually turn that into something. What is 1.5? What is 2 degrees? What does 2.5 degrees mean? And that means, like you had said, in Orissa, some of the largest mortality increases in the country. It means something like the extremely hot days that are going to happen across the country, these really excessive heat wave days, increasing, doubling, tripling, or more across the country. So really trying to localize that for people in a way which hopefully, as Chetan was pointing out, maybe that's an easier way to hang some of these facts onto stories to really try and make it local. But it still is a really big challenge.
It is a big challenge. And I would say that as a journalist, what you've just said to me, it's a story that would make headlines. The research that you're talking about, the statistics, they are indeed overwhelming. And you're talking about a state which is already reeling from a number of problems, whether it's poverty or malnutrition. Did you look at different scenarios in your research? So one could be perhaps business as usual, and another could be if we were to curb our emissions, what would happen then?
So yes, we've looked at, for this particular research about mortality, we've looked at two different scenarios. One where emissions kind of continue unmitigated, really, or with very limited mitigation, and another one where the temperature, the emissions would peak in the middle of the century, and the temperature would stabilize by the end of the century at somewhere around 2.5 degrees. So it was quite similar to what the Paris Accord 2015, the NDCs or the INDCs after that would have gotten us to, and it's quite similar still to what COP26 would say. And we found a huge difference for India. So to put a comparison on those, if the unmitigated emissions, that would lead to about a 10% increase in the death rate in India due to climate change. So that extra 10% is happening because of this extreme heat exposure. With the one closer to the now to the COP26 type of goal, that would drop down to about a 2% increase. So it's still an increase. India still gets harmed, but even with that, it's a huge benefit to India.
Okay, so what you're actually saying to me, and I'm going to try and give it a positive spin. What you're saying to me is, if we curb our emissions, we could actually save lives. For me, that's the story. The more emissions we cut, the more lives we can save. India stands perhaps to gain the most. Chetan, as a news person, let me ask you now, how do we tell the news story better? Because I found this as a constant challenge in the newsroom, constantly, fighting with my editor, that this is as important. So do you find that as a struggle as well, that, the climate change stories tend to be very doom and gloom? The narrative perhaps is becoming very boring and predictable.
I think making it political is a very good way of actually going about it, because it is all about politics, because that's where the change is going to come in, from policy, right? So now how can we make it better? It seems strange because there are a lot of activists who say that, how can climate change not be the biggest story every day in your prime time, in your headlines, which, I mean, is understandable, but it's not very practical for a newsroom, as I mentioned earlier. One way that we can actually help in this, or help push it, is a closer synergy between newsrooms, journalists, and science data-based organizations, groups.
Yes.
And there are a couple of them, there are only a couple that I've come across, but like EPIC, for instance, or the World Review attribution, that extreme weather attribution that has begun. These are extremely useful. What they do is they take current events and they give you a context for them. So for instance, if it's air pollution, EPIC's annual reports that come out will tell you how bad it is and how many, the lives that can be, the years of life that can be saved. That has tremendous impact. Similarly, with this extreme weather attribution, if they tell you, they analyze, and I believe it's quite expensive, but they analyze, they pick a, say, the European floods or the floods in America, and they'll tell you what exactly the link with climate change is. It immediately adds a lot of depth and to your coverage, a different dimension than just, okay, this is the amount of rain, this is the amount of people who have lost their lives, and this is the loss in whatever billions of dollars. So it adds a perspective, and that kind of perspective is something that can A, influence voters if the place is a democracy, and B, it can influence policy. So there is a kind of reimagining of the way we do our reports and a closer synthesis between the scientists, the data experts, and the journalists.
Okay. Amir, if I can draw you into the conversation, did you present this research to policymakers, to politicians in the state of Odisha? And what did the government there have to say about your research?
We presented it, it wasn't directly to the government, but we held an event, brought in some different researchers, some kind of local policymakers were there, a lot of NGOs, and a lot of the local media as well. We presented it in Delhi, and there was some members of the government there for that. So it was, I think, well received, as much as you can receive news like this well. People listen to it. And I think to some extent, we try to do what Chetan is saying. There is this challenge between science and communicating science. You know, my incentive as a researcher, or what should be my incentive, is to lock myself in my office and write a lot of papers and try to talk only to a bunch of other people who write papers and try and make sure that my paper advances this little bit of knowledge that might be part of a discussion that's happening only between those researchers. And so they end up being, you know, quite complicated or impenetrable, difficult to read, difficult to communicate. And I think there's a lot of information that we really leave on the table, which is enormously valuable to people. In terms of just letting people know what's going on in the world, that I think scientists have the ability to try and analyze, but the incentive structure is wrong. There's not that many people who are sitting down saying, I'm able to make a career from doing this. And I think that's just that's a problem. We don't emphasize communication of this research at the level where it's important to try and communicate as much as we should be.
Amir, I'm so glad that you said that, because even as a journalist, we find that accessing scientists is a problem. Scientists often have to get permission, and even when they agree to talk to you, it's a challenge to decode or understand the language that they're speaking in. Chetan can perhaps reflect more on this, but it's difficult to tell the climate story. But I found over the years, Chetan, would you not say that perhaps air pollution gives us that hook to tell the climate story better?
It absolutely does, and this is something that I've been tracking quite closely. And just coming to the point of the scientists, I have to say that the level of research and work being done by Indian government scientists in this is actually amazing. You say that it's very difficult. They're very difficult to speak to and to access, which is true. But they have done years and years of really solid work, which, I mean, to Amir's point, is actually buried, making it easily publicly accessible. It's all there out in the open, but making it accessible to the common man is quite a task. Coming back to the issue of air pollution and the topicality, I think it's again something that comes in, during this peak pollution month. Why should that be? Because the pollution that we are seeing right now is pollution that's emitted throughout the year. Yes. Even during the monsoon, when the levels fall because of the rain washes the pollution away. So how can that actually be an everyday story? Because it is an everyday story. It's just that we notice it now because of Met issues. That is the challenge. And again, that's something that data and the scientists can really help in. A lot of it is out in the open, but a lot of it is sort of buried in jargon, and it's very difficult to analyze. There was a study about a year and a half ago, I think, which said that only 20% people in certain whatever studies they were doing in the cohorts that they were analyzing, only 20% knew what AQI meant. But about over 50% realized that air pollution was a big problem. Probably over the 2/3 realized. So there is a mismatch between the science that's happening and how it's concerning people. So there is a demand and there is a supply, but there's a gap in between.
Yes, it's interesting the parallels that you're drawing between air pollution and climate change, because that's exactly what the data on climate change is telling us as well. When surveys have been done, for instance, with farmers or fishermen, people who may not understand the technical terms like emissions or even what climate change is, they understand that this is happening. They understand that there are changes in weather patterns, the time that when they used to sow the seeds, that's no longer happening. The agricultural seasons are changing, but they all acknowledge, while they may not be able to say it in the same scientific terms, everybody acknowledges that change is happening as far as local weather conditions are concerned, and it's impacting their livelihoods. So Amir, as we come to the end of this conversation, I'm curious to know, what are the key policy takeaways that you would give, say, if a government official was sitting in front of you, or if the Chief Minister of Odisha was present here, what would you say to him?
I think there's two things. The first one is, this is, to some extent, we're hoping our research can be kind of like a user manual for where to invest in adaptation, and to try and say, well, we know that this is going to be a major issue. We know how it's going to compare to other major issues we're facing in terms of health. We're also looking at other things like agriculture and future. And so where do we, if we have money to adapt, which we might have to do, where do we invest that? And I think that's one of the big things to kind of take away, to hopefully make this useful research. I think perhaps a broader point at a higher policy level is to say, I think, as you've been saying all along, let's also focus on the benefits that we get from mitigation. Let's not just look at the costs, but let's add up what these benefits might be. And I think we started talking about COP26, and I think internationally, India has been kind of framed as the villain because of this issue at the end of talking about not phasing out coal. But I think India, in years future, what we'll probably, or I hope we'll take away from that, is the fact that what India is saying is, it's a country that's going to face a lot of the worst impacts, and this is not a problem being caused by itself to a large extent. And so what we should focus on when thinking about those benefits is to say, here's the benefits, here's the lives that can be saved, here's the people who are currently farming in vulnerable agriculture who can be protected if we mitigate, and take that to the table in the negotiations and say, this is why we need the finance internationally. This is not just India saying we can't do anything. It's recognizing there's real costs to those policies, but arguing from the international community to try and get those benefits.
I think what you've said is very relevant. I do think some attempt needs to be made at better PR, so to say. We've seen it, at COP26 as well, while the environment minister was constantly saying over there as well that, look, here is what India is doing. Somehow the message wasn't going across, and India did get a lot of bad press, like I mentioned before, in terms of net zero emissions and our net zero targets. We are walking the talk. We need access to better technology, but perhaps we need to spin that story better as far as international negotiations are concerned. Chetan, as a seasoned journalist, if you had a policymaker in the room or perhaps coming to your studios, what would you say to him?
Well, on air pollution, it would be immediate that, this needs year-round action and not just knee-jerk reactions when October and November come around. On climate change, it would be to recognize that while India does need to develop, it also needs to, and it needs to burn coal to develop, which is a fairly strong argument that they have made, and there's a big moral basis to that. But we are suffering, our people are suffering first, right? Yes. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed, and we should not shy away from taking that head on. We already have very good policies in place, but they're only on paper. For instance, the cleanup and of cutting emissions at coal-fired power plants and things like that. It's already there. So push that along. It's cheaper to get those done, whatever 80,000, 90,000 crores that might cost. It's cheaper to get that done than the health costs.
All right. So we've come nearly to the end of our discussion today. Lots of points discussed, lots of suggestions made. Amir, your research, when I looked at it, I have to say, a bit overwhelmed. Like, as a journalist, one is always trying to avoid those doom and gloom stories. But I would, as we discussed, give a positive spin to it. If the world were to put more money on mitigation, if we were to do more on climate action, we could actually save lives. And I think that's how we need to tell the story. Chetan, you shared a number of suggestions, how we need to de-jargonize, how we need better access to scientists. I think these are great suggestions, and especially journalists who are coming into this field, who want to report more on climate change. These are good tips for them. And I think that the work that Epic India is in fact doing in terms of the conversations that that are happening right now, that's also particularly useful, because what we're trying to do is decode some of the research that comes out. So I can just say thank you to both my panelists. Thank you to Epic India for curating this. If you're watching, thank you very much.